Friends, we're reassembling, and this is buy one, get one free. So you get me a second time. And this time the panel's on proliferation. And as with the last presentation, my colleagues will be following and talking about specifics and cases and stuff that is interesting. And I won't be. So I'm going to talk about the more general picture. And again, because I think this is important, the models we have in our heads, the implicit and explicit models that we have in our heads that we carry into judgments that may not be right, but that definitely affect policymakers, and they probably affect the press as well. So I'm starting with the big picture. And when we talk about the spread of nuclear weapons, this is the sort of model everyone has in their head, right? It's sort of a cascade model. You know, the Nazis had a program and we got scared, so we started our program. And when we got one, the Russians felt threatened, so they got one. And the Chinese did, and so the Indians responded to the Chinese, and the Pakistanis responded to the Indians. I thought Deepen had a very good point suggesting that that's really not the origin of the Pakistani program. It was really something else. But that's the way we think about it. 2, 4, 8, 10, 20. And in fact, if you look in the archives at all the predictions made by policymakers in the intelligence community, in the military, and elsewhere, they all predicted nuclear spread in that same way, cascades, 2, 4, 8, 12. So that's how we think about it. And that chart is the total number of nuclear weapon states over time, and it goes up. Now, if you read a lot of charts, you'll notice that this is a rather gentle slope, and it sort of flattens out after a while. So that's one thing. But there's another way to look at the same data about the spread of nuclear weapons, and that's looking at the rate of proliferation. How many new nuclear weapon states have joined the club in each decade of the nuclear age? And it turns out the peak decade for membership of the Nuclear Weapons Club was the 1960s, when you had France, Israel, and China join. And in every succeeding decade, fewer and fewer countries have joined the Nuclear Weapons Club. And so it's not been a spread. If anything, it's a peak and a decline. And that includes North Korea. In fact, when you dig into the history a little bit, you see that 3/4 of the countries that were interested in nuclear weapons started down that path, stopped, and reversed course. Now, some of them just did paper studies, some of them went pretty far down the line, but in any case, a lot of countries, not surprisingly, did look at becoming nuclear weapon states, and for a variety of reasons, did not end up in the club. And that's the list. I think the list is actually longer than this, but we don't have data on all the countries' histories. The ones in green are obviously the countries that inherited nuclear assets after the fall of the Soviet Union. And so while, in our minds, we sort of think of the spread, you heard this during the debate over the Iran agreement, in fact, it's a very different outcome. And in fact, you might say that non-proliferation is the biggest public policy success of the 20th century, perhaps on par with the abolition of slavery in the 19th century. We have far fewer nuclear weapon states than predicted. We have fewer countries seeking nuclear weapons today than in the past. In other words, the pool of potential proliferants has declined. In the 50s and 60s, a lot of those countries that were on that list in the previous slide, those were countries that were thinking about their nuclear future in the 50s and 60s. Now, the number of countries that might be considering nuclear weapons is a handful at most, I think. Since the 1990s, more countries have given up nuclear weapons than acquired them. And of Walsh's list of 9 violators of the NPT, countries I think have violated their NPT commitments, only one became a nuclear weapon state, North Korea. And if you look up in a dictionary the word outlier, you see a map of North Korea. I mean, it sort of tells you something that the weirdest country of the entire planet is the one who ended up being the member of the club. Now that raises, a question. How is it that we have the most powerful weapon in human history, and that states value power, value weapons, and yet this weapon did not spread against all predictions? Well, the social science offers a variety of theories about this. Some people think it's all about power and security, and so if those countries didn't get weapons, it's because they weren't feeling threatened, or because they got a security guarantee from the United States or the Soviet Union. or we pressured them out of it. You know, we went in and talked them out of it and threatened them, and they backed off. I think, you know, some of those are right in some cases. Some people argue, well, it's not so much about power and security, it's about resources, lack of money, scientists, unable to get foreign technology. Other people talk about institutions. I'm going to hold off because I'm going to focus on one of those explanations. I can explain those in question and answer. And some people think it's about anti-nuclear norms. I actually don't think it's about anti-nuclear norms. I think what you see when you look at nuclear history is the norm develops after the fact. Now, so it's still valuable. It reinforces the notion that countries should not acquire nuclear weapons, but it comes rather late in the game if you look at polling data and if you look at the attitudes of elite policymakers. So I'm going to focus on one in particular, and that's the non-proliferation regime, and in particular the NPT. There's more to the regime than the NPT. There are all sorts of agreements that reinforce and support the notion that states should not pursue nuclear weapons, or they should abandon the ones they have, or they should constrain the ones they have. But I want to talk about the NPT. So the NPT's core elements, sometimes called the three pillars, are non-proliferation. Weapon states, I think in Article 1, promise not to share their nuclear weapons with other countries, and that was actually a live question in the 50s and 60s. Would the United States share nuclear weapons? Eisenhower was inclined to want to do that. And so under the NPT, weapon states promise not to share, and the non-nuclear weapon states promise not to accept or develop their own nuclear weapons. Second pillar is peaceful uses. NPT members, because these non-nuclear weapon states who are giving up the right to nuclear weapons, giving up their sovereignty, are repaid in part by having access to civilian nuclear technology. Obviously, they enjoy other benefits too. A proliferated world is dangerous, but one of the promises, one of the bennies, is supposed to be access to civilian nuclear technology. And then finally, disarmament. Article 6 in the NPT obliges nuclear weapon states to, quote, pursue negotiations in good faith towards nuclear disarmament. So non-proliferation, peaceful uses, and disarmament. Now, the NPT has lots of flaws. You know, if states get nuclear weapons because they feel threatened, and that, in my view, that's only one reason. Prestige matters, organizational politics matters. But if threat is sort of one of the main reasons states pursue nuclear weapons, the treaty doesn't do anything about threats. It doesn't reduce the fact that, you know, we hate Russia or the Russians hate us, right? There's no ban on weapons material. You know, if you want to enrich uranium to 60-70% for a nuclear submarine that's civilian, or at least doesn't carry nuclear weapons, you can do that. You can do whatever you want. You just can't accept or build a nuclear weapon. There are no limits on enrichment and reprocessing, and so we have big disagreements now. The U.S., and I am on the U.S. side on this, says there is no right to enrichment and reprocessing. Other countries, like our friends Germany and Japan, think there is. And this was an issue during the Iran negotiations when Iran insisted it had a right, and the U.S. said that it didn't, and they sort of fudged it in the preamble, which is what you do in diplomacy. No cap on enrichment levels, no enforcement clause. Let's say you violate it. What happens? Treaty doesn't say. And there's, of course, the problem of countries that don't join, or in the case of North Korea, withdraw. Obviously, Pakistan, India, and Israel are all three countries, nuclear weapon states outside of the treaty. We have to pick up the pace here. So, how is it that a policy that ignores the main causes of proliferation, threats, and a treaty full of holes, far weaker than the JCPOA, in my view, far weaker than the Iran agreement, achieved one of the greatest public policy successes of the 20th century? Quite a puzzle. And I would suggest that it worked in very unexpected ways. It drew a line in the sand. And so in the old days, you know, if you were a defense minister, you could whisper into the ear of your prime minister and say, we should have a nuclear weapon. And the prime minister would say no. And then that minister of defense said, well, just wait for the next prime minister. And it was all done in secret and no one would know. Well, now there's a treaty. You either sign it or you don't. And you sort of declared to the public what your position is. And it reframed the debate. It used to be a defense decision. Now it's a foreign policy decision. So different people get to sit at the table, different people get a vote. And it created political winners and losers. You know, once you ratify the NPT, it's really tough for the pro-nuclear crowd to make a comeback. You know, pre-NPT, again, you just wait for the next prime minister or president. After NPT and you're ratified and a member and you have safeguards agreements and all the rest of it, sort of hard for the losers to make a comeback. And it is a dynamic, asymmetric, and enmeshing. The language of the NPT has remained the same, but the safeguards agreements have become more and more and more intrusive and robust over time, usually in the aftermath of a crisis. There's some crisis. Iraq violates its safeguards agreements, so we develop new rules to deal with that. Okay, all right. And so even though the language is the same, the institutions have been dynamic. So what are the implications of that for today? Well, I think we need to give up this, it's inevitable it's going to be spread. Remember, candidate Trump said, oh, it's inevitable that Japan and South Korea would get nuclear weapons, and wouldn't that be a good thing? Ignore the second part, the first part's wrong. It's not inevitable, and as I say, the trend is in the other direction. Regimes help. You know, we should focus on what works. We have a lot of success here. Maybe we should focus on what works and build on that. And we should pay as much attention to politics, which is the driver in most cases, as technology. And maybe we ought to think about the fact that the countries that have nuclear weapons are as dangerous or more dangerous than the ones that want them but don't have them. Right? If you don't have it, you can't use it. But we have nuclear weapon states that have them. Maybe they're dangerous. Is the NPT in crisis? Yes and no. I mean, there's some bad news here. There's a real political split between the nuclear weapon states and the non-nuclear weapon states. The nuclear weapon states want the non-nuclear weapon states, you know, to adopt more safeguards and more stringent stuff and do sanctions. And, you know, the list of things is never ending that the nuclear weapon states want the non-nuclear weapon states to do to improve non-proliferation. But the non-nuclear weapon states say, what about your part of the deal? You said you're going to negotiate and get rid of your weapons. And in 2018, Russia and the US have released statements or postures that suggest they're moving in the opposite direction. They want to build more. So the non-nuclear weapon states, not surprisingly, may ask themselves, you know, why the hell should we go along with what you're doing? You're not keeping up your end of the bargain. And on enrichment and reprocessing, and I think that matters, by the way. I think what the nuclear weapons, non-nuclear weapon states, you can just, you know, disregard them. Oh, that's the non-aligned movement, blah, 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 blah. But again, if a regime is a political compact, and we need others to work with us to achieve our goals, we need them to enforce the sanctions. We need them to provide political support. We need them to do things. Well, if they feel like they're getting the shaft, they're not going to be less excited about doing the things we want them to do. And on enrichment and reprocessing, this is playing out with Saudi Arabia right now. You know, if you're too soft and let everyone have enrichment and reprocessing, I don't think the NPT is a survivable regime. But if you're too strict, there are dangers that, you'll be rejected. And the countries will go rogue and find other countries that are willing to sell them enrichment and reprocessing. I don't think there's an easy answer to that. I mean, I know what I prefer, but as a political reality, it's not an easy task. Now, the good news is the NPT is a survivor. I mean, I wish I had a dime for every time people predicted the end of the regime. I would not be here. I would be in Anguilla, which is an island near St. Martin. It was supposed to fall after the Soviet Union. It was supposed to fall after the revelations about Iraq. It was supposed to fall, after the Indian and Pakistani tests. And yet here it is. And the rules and verification have gotten stronger over time, not weaker. So I think it's a mixed message. And I think this is my last slide. Yes, thankfully my last slide. So having talked about the regime and talked about the spread of nuclear weapons, I'd like to contrast in a very simplified, maybe simplistic way, what I would suggest are the bizarre ways in which U.S. policymakers think about proliferation. That's too strongly stated. The first one, we're all going to die. That's the one like, weapons are going to spread. If we do this one thing, if we have the Iran agreement, if we have X, if we have Y, it's going to lead to a dramatic spread in nuclear weapons. Well, that's not what history says. Israel's had a nuclear weapon since 1967. Name all the other nuclear weapon states in the Middle East. Yeah, 0. So I think the evidence for cascades is weak. What's the other thing, a couple of other things policymakers say? If we're going to get proliferation by beating people with a stick. We're going to threaten them, and we're going to coerce them, and we're going to sanction them. Sanction, sanction, sanctions. And even after they agree, we're going to still beat them with a stick. I think we know who we're talking about there. And I would suggest, actually, that political agreements are important, I would say more important than coercion. Coercion's a policy tool. It's important. You got to use it. You wouldn't want to drop it. But at the end of the day, it's political agreements that get you where you want to be. But there's very little discussion of that. No one wants to negotiate with that evil, awful adversary. Preventive war. We hear Lindsey Graham and others talk about preventive war, fight it over there rather than here. You can imagine how the South Koreans like that. But we really haven't had an instance of preventive war against a nuclear weapon state. And of course in Iraq, they were not a nuclear weapon state. Build more nuclear weapons. That's what the posture review says. That's what, in essence, in my view, the modernization means. But for reasons discussed in my last presentation, more doesn't really buy you a lot. If I have 101 nuclear weapons and my adversary has 100, it doesn't really matter if you lose your first 4 cities. So I don't know what more means. I think that's still an attachment to thinking about it as if it's a conventional weapon and not really fully recognizing the meaning of the nuclear revolution. And there's a real tendency, I know this from testifying on Capitol Hill, to focus on technology, will they have this, will they have that? And I think it's, as a result, we don't pay enough attention to politics. Why is it that states pursue nuclear weapons? What are the conditions under which they pursue nuclear weapons? And I guess my final line here would be, when it comes to nuclear weapons, in my view, the engineering is harder than the science, the program management is harder than the engineering, and the politics is harder than the program management. The states that succeed at nuclear weapons are states that make it a political priority, make it job one, and go and get it done. The ones who sort of hedge and say, well, I sort of want that. That's a lot of the countries that were on that slide that were interested but didn't end up nuclear weapon states. Why? Because they didn't make it a political priority. And so it's really more about politics, the internal politics of potential proliferators, than it is about technology. I can't believe I got through that line. I might try to say that again, but not now. So that's it for me. With that as a general overview, you'll be able to hear much more interesting things being said about the particular policy challenges we face today.